Darkcast Network. Out of the shadows come the best indie podcasts.
Hey everyone, welcome to True Crime California. I'm your host Cindy, and I'm glad you're here. Hey everybody, welcome back. Sorry I took an unexpected 2 weeks off. I just had stuff going on in my regular life, and when you don't make a ton of money on a podcast, it's not always top priority when things go sideways. So I apologize. I definitely want to be better about not missing weeks, but life comes at you fast, like Ferris Bueller said. So, you got to do what you got to do. Anyway, I'm back. I promise not to take such a long breaks again. I know it's bad, especially considering how, new this podcast is. But had to happen, won't happen again. Thank you all for tuning back in now that I am back. I'm going to just jump in because it's been long enough. I've kept you waiting long enough. I'm going to do the story of Richard Chase, otherwise known as the Vampire of Sacramento or the Dracula Killer. So we're doing another Sacramento-based. We did Dorothea Puente. And now we're doing Richard Chase. The major cities have a lot of serial killers, murderers. So it's pretty easy to ping pong back and forth between them. And I got to tell you, I hate this case. Hate it. Glad I'm doing it, but man, this guy sucks. And honestly, it's just a bummer of a case start to finish. So let's just get into that. Richard Chase was born May 23rd, 1950 in Santa Clara County, which is not too far from Sacramento. And I want to take a moment to call out that so many serial killers are Geminis, which I don't love because my son's birthday is May 25th. And as far as I can tell, there is not yet a serial killer with that birth date. I'm totally kidding, but I do think about this because when you have a true crime podcast, these are the types of things you think about. So yes, I am a little bit worried, but not really, but also sort of. Anyway. So Richard Chase was born to Richard Edgar and Beatrice Chase, and he was born very shortly after the couple married and had a younger sister, Pamela. Now, Richard had a pretty unremarkable childhood. He was loved and supported by his parents. His father was a bit of a disciplinarian, but nothing out of the ordinary for the 1950s. Now, what that means, I'm not 100% sure. My dad grew up in the 1950s, and he went to a Catholic school, and the nuns there could, beat the children. So if your teachers could beat you in the 50s, then I imagine your parents could as well. And if his father was known as a disciplinarian, then what it sounds like to me is the kids got hit. Whatever that means, whatever that looks like, I don't know. I do know that a lot of people at that time went through it, but I also know there's a lot of serial killers born in the 40s and 50s. So is there a correlation? I don't know. Quite possibly. I do know that his mother took issue with his father's methods, but this had more to do probably with the fact that his parents just fought about everything. So it was just another thing for her to be mad at his dad about. And in fact, his parents split up for a time when he was young, but got back together only to separate permanently when Richard was a young adult. So while we say, he had a pretty normal childhood, there definitely was some discord in the house. I don't know that that's enough to make a serial killer. Or mass murderer, or however you want to I think serial killer is the more appropriate, but it's definitely worth noting. Now, that being said, Richard was a popular kid. He had I think it was his first birthday party, had 60 people in attendance. So at least on the outside, things seemed very normal. But despite all of this, Richard was always a little off, I guess we could say. And it was later discovered that he exhibited all three major components of the McDonald triad. Now, for those who don't know, the McDonald triad, it's not really used as a 100% hardcore indicator anymore of serial killers or murderers, but it's a set of three factors, the presence of any two of which are considered to be predictive of or associated with violent tendencies, particularly with relation to serial offenses. So this used to be kind of the Bible. Oh, if you have one, two or three of those, you're for sure a murderer. But now it's shown that yeah, those people who have these tendencies might not have like the greatest life, but they're not necessarily going to be violent. They're not necessarily going to be murderers or criminals. They might just have these tendencies, and nothing comes of it. So anyway, these 3 factors are bedwetting after the age of 5, arson, and harming animals. So this was proposed in 1963 by J.M. MacDonald, who was a psychiatrist and used by the FBI for a time, like I said. Though now, again, like I said, it's not a truly valid line of thinking because anybody can have these and nothing may happen. But it's never a good thing to hit all 3 marks for obvious reasons. And Richard nailed all 3. Probably the only time he got 100% on a test. Anyway, by the age of 10, Richard had killed and buried a neighborhood cat in his mother's garden. When interviewed later, a neighbor of the family told police that Beatrice had told her she found the cat in the garden and that Richard had put it there after killing it. The neighbor said she also noticed around that time that a lot of cats had gone missing, but hadn't really put it together until much later, which I find interesting. You're like, a lot of cats are missing. My neighbor showed me a dead cat in her yard and said it was her kid. And then you don't make the connection. That's strange to me. And it's also strange to me that she remembered this like many, many years later, but hadn't ever connected the dots. It's an interesting set of circumstances. I don't know. Anyway, not a great sign for Richard. Even so, all the way through high school, he was well liked. He had a lot of friends, a lot of dates, and a few girlfriends. He was clean cut, he was friendly, he was popular, at least for a time. But as previously noted, he was also real fucking weird and still hurting animals regularly and got very, very into drugs during high school. He also had a lot of weird habits as a teen, including thinking he was part of Jesse James' gang, even though Jesse James died in 1882. At first, people thought this was like a quirky little thing. You know how kids are like, I'm a vampire, like I'm a goth, whatever. People were like, oh, he's just like finding his identity. He's just like joking around. But like, no, he really like thought like he had delusions that he was a part of this gang. So really, really weird. He also did a lot of really weird things around the house at this time, like turning the heat up as high as it would go and lying naked in the middle of the family's living room with all the windows in the house open. So he was doing a lot of really strange things. And again, from the age of 10 all the way through the end of his life or whenever he was caught, he was consistently killing animals, cats, dogs, rabbits. We'll talk more about it. It's a kind of a trigger warning case for that, if nothing else. It's always interesting when we have a true crime podcast and we are like talking about killing people, but then it's like, oh, trigger warning, kitty gets hurt. But like, I get it. You know, we're here for one thing. We're not necessarily here for the other. So in any case, just please keep in mind that there will be some talking about that. I don't go like into detail too much, but it is sort of important to the case, which I think is why I hate this case so much. So moving on, let's go back to talking about his girlfriends. He did have like a few, but none for very long. And the reason for this is that he was impotent. He could not maintain an erection. One woman later said she had attempted to have sex with him multiple times before finally giving up and ending the relationship because she didn't think that she could have a romantic relationship with somebody that she wasn't able to have sex with. So this is very frustrating for Richard, who up into this time actually went by the name Rick. But anyway, this led to him being very angry with women. And also it's thought that his impotence may have stemmed from a pre-existing hatred for women, potentially kind of started by his hatred for his mother, and then not being able to have sex when he wanted to with, willing participants made it even worse. So it was sort of like a problem that became compounded. And then the hatred for women, the hatred towards his mother, the impotence, it all just kind of kept feeding into itself like a feedback loop or something. So really, really bad. And again, there wasn't really any real reason for him to feel any hatred towards his mother, but sometimes you don't really need a reason. Maybe he blamed her for his parents' split. Like I know that happens a lot. The dad doesn't get blamed, but the mom does. Anyway, what I do know is that as time went on, Richard became more and more strange and more wrapped in up in drugs. He was regularly smoking weed, taking LSD, sometimes even using like amphetamines, meth. After graduating high school, Richard became more unkempt and disheveled. So he'd been like clean cut, showered, looked pretty normal. And then as time went on, he started to grow his hair. He stopped showering so much. He was just kind of gross. He did go to college. He began attending American River College in Sacramento, which is a community college, but he missed most of his classes and eventually dropped out. So now we're in 1971. Richard's nearly 21 years old. He has no direction, no job besides selling drugs. He basically did that to support his own drug use, and he was a dirty, messy mess of a person. And again, still regularly harming animals. Now, I want to talk about why he was harming animals, because to this point, I've just kind of said, oh yeah, he's harming animals and left it at that. The reason that he's harming animals was in order to drink their blood. And he would do this because he thought that was how he replaced his own blood, which he believed was turning to powder in his body or was not being pumped through his body because his heart would stop beating from time to time. And also, occasionally, when asked, he would tell people that somebody stole his pulmonary artery. So he's having all of these weird delusions about the blood in his own body. And in his twisted up mind, his solution to this was to kill animals and drink their blood, because obviously that's how it works. So in fact, even before leaving high school, Richard had killed a kitten named Calico Kitten, which was given to him by one of his girlfriends. He actually loved this cat and had raised it for a while. But one night he was home alone and he saw a TV show about animals getting good veterinary care. And he became angry because he felt he could not get good care for his ailments. He had gone to the doctors multiple times, told them about his pulmonary artery being stolen, told them that he felt like his blood wasn't pumping. They would check him, everything would be fine, and they'd send him home. So to Richard, he was convinced something was wrong and he wasn't being taken seriously and he wasn't being helped. And then he saw these cats on TV getting good health care, veterinary care. So that made him mad. He took the cat outside, killed it, and drank his blood. So this type of behavior started very young for him, as I noted, 10 years old, and progressed before he was even a legal adult. And now, in his early 20s, while attending college and for a while after, Richard would take on odd jobs, none of which lasted very long, and continued just harming animals and selling drugs. Now, eventually he did move into an apartment and he got 2 roommates. Now, I've read that he met these women, Sid DeMarchi and Rachel Statham, by sitting in front of their apartment and asking to be their roommates. But I also read that one of them knew him from high school, so there was some level of familiarity there. But essentially, he was like, hey, y'all need a roommate? And they're like, sure. And they all moved in together. This is something that they came to regret for sure. Now, Richard would sell drugs to pay his rent, and in addition to this, his parents gave him $50 a month towards his bills. And they did this because neither of them wanted to or could handle living with Richard, so they were trying to keep him out of their homes. Because, again, he's doing these weird things, laying naked in the middle of the house, cranking the heat up, opening the windows, saying that his blood's drying out and his pulmonary artery's been stolen. And obviously his parents knew that he was killing animals. His mom told somebody when he was 10. So she'd been living with him for, 10 years plus, knowing he's doing this. So of course, as soon as they could get rid of him, his parents were like super happy to do so and paid him money to stay the fuck out of their house. Now, as you can imagine, or if you can't imagine, I'll tell you, things did not go well with his roommates. One of them, I'm sure both, but one of them specifically, thought that Richard was absolutely disgusting, noting that he never bathed, never changed his clothing, never brushed his hair, and never cleaned anything at the house. And again, super fucking weird. He was just a super weird guy. They did not like being around him. An example of his weirdness is that one time, just as he did in his, parents' home, he came into the living room completely naked and laid on the floor. Another time, he locked himself inside his room, then inside his closet, and wouldn't come out. He later said he did this because people were sneaking up on him from inside the house. So this is, obviously there's some mental health issues going on. Obviously, this is not great. Now, at one point, the women asked him to move out, but he refused. So instead, they both just left. They didn't give him notice. They didn't want any kind of conflict. They just bailed out so as to avoid any conflict. Now, from there, Richard had another roommate briefly, but that went about the same way this first round of roommates went. And finally, he was left alone in the apartment, which he could not afford, even with dealing drugs and help from his now divorced parents. In 1972, he had to move back in with his mother, and things went downhill from here. He accused her of poisoning him repeatedly, as well as continually saying he was dying, his heart wasn't beating. I mean, he'd have these like big blow-ups at the house where he was like seemingly in so much pain and so much distress, but really there was nothing. It was all just mental. But his mom was having to deal with this and having to deal with him accusing her of trying to kill him. I mean, it's pretty crazy. Now, he bounced back and forth between his parents for a while because his mom was like, I cannot do this on my own. But eventually, neither of them were able to deal with him. So they finally sent him to live with his grandmother down in Los Angeles. Now, in fact, they had done this before, but this time he stayed with her for an entire year, whereas before it was like a month or two, just a little break, something to kind of like give them a rest from this guy. But this time he stayed down there. He even got a job with her and his uncle, who ran a school for disabled children. Now, Richard, this is insane, especially when you know more about this story. He worked as a bus driver for the school, meaning that this man had the lives of multiple children in his care twice a day for an entire year. And these are at-risk children. This is an at-risk population. Absolutely fucking terrifying. After a while, he ended up back in Sacramento after his grandma realized there was something very wrong with him. And now she tried to tell him, you know, she should try to get him on the right track. She tried to help out, tell him he was a good boy, you know, he was doing the best he could. There's nothing wrong with him. But eventually she was like, nah, you gotta go. Like, you're too fucking weird. From there, once he was back in Sacramento, he pretty quickly went to the hospital, complained about his blood not working, the artery thing. He said, I'm dead, I'm dying. He one time said that his stomach was in backwards. All sorts of crazy shit. He was diagnosed as schizophrenic and remanded to a mental hospital, which he quickly escaped by walking out the front door. Now, at this point, he was not legally required to be there, so they just let him go, despite knowing he should stay and be treated. They didn't have any cause to force him to stay, so they let him go. Now, after this, his parents decided, we're going to get you your own apartment, Richard, and we'll pay for it because we cannot deal with you. Richard wasn't working, but got himself a bike and would bike around looking like a fucking ghoul with this long, stringy hair, gaunt appearance, dirty clothing. I mean, absolutely gross. Now, around this time, as soon as he was living by himself, he also started buying rabbits from a local rabbit farm and would keep them in cages in his house. And before you go, how is that possible that he could buy rabbits from a rabbit farm? He lives in a major city. Sacramento's a farm town. Sacramento has tons of farmland, tons of farms, tons of wild animals and, you know, livestock, rabbits, this kind of thing. So when I read that, I was like, oh yeah, I bet I could fucking find the corner that place was on. You know, if you know Sacramento at all, you know, it's a lot of, it's very rural for a big city, weirdly. So anyway, he would kill and eat the rabbits. He would not cook them. He would drink their blood directly from their dead bodies. He would also use a blender to grind up their organs, which he would also eat. And he did this to replace his own organs, most specifically his heart, which he believed was shrinking and would eventually disappear. So just like his answer to his missing blood was to drink animal blood, his answer to his shrinking heart was to eat the organs of rabbits to prevent that from happening. Now, you know, he didn't have any oversight. He's living by himself. So he was able to do this without anybody really knowing what was going on. So he got away with this for a really long time. And he would just sort of bike around the neighborhood on his bicycle and get these rabbits from this rabbit farm, who I wonder what they thought he was doing. I mean, maybe they thought he was cooking and eating them. I guess that's fair. I don't think if they knew that he was eating them raw and drinking their blood, they would have kept selling them to him. But basically, he went on doing this for like some months. his dad would come over like occasionally for lunch, kind of to check in, make sure he's okay. And one day he came over and he found Richard shaking on his living room floor, wearing nothing but a pair of shorts. Now, his father took him to the hospital as Richard was clearly very sick, and their doctors determined that he had blood poisoning. Now, Richard told the doctors it's because he ate a rabbit who had ingested battery acid, which, like, how would the rabbit have done that? And how would that have poisoned him? But that's what he told them happened. So he ate the rabbit ate battery acid. So now there's battery acid in his system. And it's like, okay, well, did you eat the rabbit's stomach? Like right after it ate the battery acid? Like what? Very, very, very strange. And I'm sure the doctors were like, what the fuck is wrong with this guy? So I think this sort of tipped them off to do some more testing. And doctors pretty quickly discovered that what had actually happened is that Richard got a hold of some hypodermic needles and had injected himself with the rabbit blood, which is super, super dangerous. Now, later when asked why he did this, he said it's because his own blood wasn't enough. And as we've talked about, his idea was to supplement it with animal blood. Now, this trip to the hospital, because he had been to the hospital a few times, because of his pulmonary artery missing and his stomach being in backwards and his blood turning to dust. But this trip landed him in the psych ward. Unfortunately, this was another very short stay, but it did get him in there because clearly this man is mentally ill. He's suffering. He needs help. Now, I believe he went into the hospital in the early summer of 1976 and was released in September. The nurses where he was, they were like, do not let this man out. He's extremely sick. He could be dangerous for sure. You should not let him out. The nurses were all against it. But his doctor, who probably didn't interact with him at all because we know how that goes, decided he was good to go. And he decided this despite his continued obsession with blood and the fact that he was found with blood covering his body 2 different times while in the hospital. This blood came from birds that he caught through his window, which he then decapitated and drank their blood and also smeared it all over himself. So he's in this mental hospital. We know that he has issues with his blood and obsession with blood. He's decapitating, probably with his bare hands, these birds, bathing in and drinking their blood. And the doctor's like, he's cool. He's cured. Let him go. And his mother also was very much in favor of his release. Now, I want to point out here that one of the things that I read about his mother when Richard was young, I think is really important. And I haven't heard a lot of podcasts talk about this. During her marriage to Richard's father, she repeatedly accused him of poisoning her. So to me, it sounds like not only may there be some, mental illness with her, but this is also something that was kind of normalized for Richard growing up. So whatever he has going on mentally, I think we also have to consider that he grew up with somebody who was making these accusations against another parent. He's got the 2 people he loves and, depends on most in the world having this type of relationship. So on top of that, I think maybe something is up with his mom as well, like mentally. And I can't say for sure, I don't know, but that kind of stuck out to me. And I haven't heard a lot of podcasts talk about that. They really mostly kind of paint his childhood as being very normal. But I do feel like there's definitely some weirdness there. So anyway, when he was released, he was given medication, but his mother very quickly weaned him off of it, saying it made him like a zombie. So it's like, would you rather have a zombie or like a blood demon? Like, I don't really know. I don't think either situation is great, but at least if he's a zombie, maybe he's not being tortured. Like, he's not torturing himself with like his mental obsessions, So basically everybody is failing this man. And to be clear, the nurses at the hospital were like, absolutely not. This is a terrible idea. And when interviewed later, one nurse said, quote, "It was his turn to be released and anything we had to say or do about it was irrelevant." So basically they were like, we need the space, get him the fuck out of here. Now from this point, he went back to living in his apartment and things escalated because of course they did. He refused to let anybody into his apartment, not his father, not his mother. He didn't have any friends. His sister was afraid of him, so she never went near him. But he basically locked himself inside of his apartment and nobody knew what was going on in there. He also started to find stray cats and dogs, more and more of them, and started drinking their blood regularly, as well as smearing it all over himself, and then like going out, like riding his bike to the rabbit farm or walking around the neighborhood covered in blood. So he's definitely escalating here. Now, he also started to buy guns, which, how did he do that? Like, I'd really like to know. But in any case, he was able to, and he'd always been into guns, but it's just scary because at this point, with everything else going on, he's also starting to carry loaded guns and have them in his home. And again, he's really just entirely on his own. His parents have given up beyond just paying for his apartment to keep him out of their lives, and he's just kind of spinning out. Now, not quite a year later, this kind of just goes on. He's like stalking people in the neighborhood. I read that he would like follow women and like follow people and spy through windows. But he's mostly keeping to himself unless you're a domesticated animal, in which case you're in big trouble with this guy. But about a year later, in August 1977, Richard ended up in Nevada somehow, and police found his Ford Ranchero, which I think his parents bought him. So he did finally get a car, a Ford Ranchero. And he, of course, took it out to Nevada and got it stuck in the sand on a reservation because this guy's not going to make a single good choice. He's not going to do a single thing that he should do. Now, I guess somebody saw this and called to report the car and suspicious activity. When police arrived, they looked in the car and they found 2 blood-stained guns, a bucket with various organs inside, blood all over the car. I mean, it was a crazy mess. And nearby, they found a naked Richard Chase covered in blood, head to toe, just completely soaked. When they asked Richard where the blood came from, he told them, "It's seeping out of me." Now, in the end, this actually turned out to be cow's blood. And that's good because he had also been traveling to Nevada with a dog, which was never found, but they did not find dog blood on him. So my best hope for that sweet dog is that it escaped and he did not hurt it. I can't say, but I hope that's the case. However, he was out on a reservation killing cows, bathing in their blood, just being fucking crazy, and then telling the police it was his blood and was literally seeping out of him, which is absolutely cuckoo bananas bonkers. Now, he was 100% arrested and held until they could figure out what was going on, but eventually they released him and they didn't charge him because they didn't find any dead cows and he wasn't really doing anything illegal. This was on his record, but nothing really happened. Once again, of course. So now he goes back to Sacramento and he continues his super fucking weird lifestyle, continuing to kill animals and drink their blood, escalating more each day. He's graduated from the bicycle to the car. He's graduated from killing animals with his hands to having guns, and he would shoot these animals. He would shoot them in the head and drink their blood that way. So an interesting thing is that I want to note that he is not like a process killer. I forget what it is, like process versus like whatever. But anyway, his point was not the killing. It was the blood. So he never intended to torture any animals or torture people in the killing part anyway. And shit gets weird and we'll get into it in the second half. There are going to be 2 parts. But I do want to call out that like the murdering itself was not his main aim. That wasn't his main thing. It was more about having the body. Kind of like Dahmer in a way. Like the killing wasn't the thing. It was like the control and the keeping the people around. So anyway, he gets back, to Sacramento in August 77. And over the next few months, he really starts stalking people. He's really kind of escalating that behavior. He would follow women home. He wouldn't interact with them, but he would like watch them. And around this time, just after Christmas 1977, he committed his first attempted murder. So between August and December 1977, he really kind of takes things up a notch. So December 27th, 1977, Dorothy Polanski was doing dishes in her home in Sacramento when she heard a loud pop, then heard some dishes in her home breaking, and then felt some heat near her head. She went into the bathroom to look, and it turned out the heat she was feeling was a bullet that had come so close to her head that it went through her hair, which was tied up in a bun. It then went all the way through her bun into some of the dishes in her kitchen. This turned out to be a bullet that matched a gun owned by Richard Chase. We don't know that yet, but later on they figured that out. Now, the weird part of this is that during this time when he's escalating to attempted murder and successful murder, he's sort of outwardly turning things around. He cuts his hair again, starts acting normal. He even tells his parents he's considering getting a job, which he should. But I think everybody thought he was a lost cause, and suddenly he starts acting kind of normal. Now, this could have definitely been in response to the fact that his family banned him from the family home because he shot their pet cat in the head and smeared its blood all over his body. He did this in front of his mother, who was like, okay, that's my limit. You can't come over anymore. So there was a sort of a tipping point even with his mom. I think that's pretty far over the line, but everybody has their own level of bullshit they'll put up with. But I think after that, he realized that he needed to dial it back if he wanted to be able to see his family, be able to be with his parents. Now, even so, his mom never again allowed him home. And I think this really pissed him off and set him off as well. And she didn't really buy into his little, oh, look how good I'm doing kind of thing. But he still kind of outwardly was getting his shit together. Inwardly, though, not so much. And the day after the attack on Dorothy, Richard committed his first actual murder. Now, this murder was a 51-year-old Ambrose Griffin who was unloading groceries with his wife in their driveway when he suddenly grabbed his chest and fell to the ground. At first, his wife thought he was having a heart attack, but once emergency services arrived, it was found he had been shot. Ambrose died at the scene. There was a witness to this crime, but they didn't have any good information, so Richard was not caught or even considered a suspect. They kind of gave they said, oh, we saw a brown car, but I think they said it was a Dodge Dart or something. They didn't say Ford Ranchero, or they gave the wrong color. And, they said a long-haired guy in 1977, good luck. That's everybody. So they didn't really have anything to go on. From here, Richard continues to escalate, and he starts breaking into homes regularly and during the day. He's just doing it kind of whenever. So on January 23rd, 1977, Richard, who had been more actively kind of stalking people, he'd always done this since before he even had a car, but he was now doing it constantly. He attempted to break into a woman's home. Now at this woman's home, he found that the doors and windows were locked, so he walked away without trying to force his way in. The woman whose home it was, she was home at the time, and she went to her back door. She met him face to face at her sliding glass door, and they kind of just looked at each other. And then he turned around and walked away. Fucking terrifying. So she's in the house, and she sees this scruffy, scraggly, potentially blood-covered dude trying her front door, trying her windows, and then just calmly walking around to the back door, which she has locked, and he just stares at her and then lights a cigarette and walks away. He later told police, it's fucking terrifying. He later told police that if a door or windows were locked, he took that as a sign that he was not welcome into the home, which is hilarious in a way because it's a real vampire. You have to invite them into your homes. I don't think that he knew that lore or was sort of maybe he was aware of that lore and played into that because he's I'm a vampire. I don't know. I don't think he ever referred to himself as a vampire, so I really don't know, but I thought that was funny because it's oh, that's in regular vampire lore, you can't come into somebody's house until they invite you. So anyway, that same day, he successfully entered the home of a young married couple, Barbara and Robert Edwards, and ransacked their house for valuables. Now, the couple came home while he was doing this, and the husband actually chased Richard, who ran out the back door. But eventually, Richard was able to jump a fence and escape. And while he was running from the guy, he said, "I'm just taking a shortcut," which is like the weirdest thing to say. Like, he was in their home. Super, super strange. So anyway, after checking the home, the couple found that Richard had gone into their baby's room and pissed in one of the drawers containing the baby's clothing. He also took a shit in the baby's crib, which is honestly terrifying. Beyond weird, that's like a very aggressive and scary thing to do. He also had rounded up some valuables, but he left them at the home as he'd been, surprised at their return. But at least he didn't shoot them because he definitely had a loaded gun in a shoulder holster, which he was wearing at the time. Now, it's unclear exactly how many burglaries he perpetrated, but his willingness to do this in broad daylight shows like a really terrifying escalation that could only end exactly the way that it did. I'm going to stop here for part 1. Part 2 is basically all the murders. I think one of the reasons this case really bothered me is there's so much lead up. There's so many opportunities for someone to step in and prevent this from happening, and nobody did. And I know we're only at about like 40 minutes here, I think, not even, but I don't want this to be like an hour or 20. And I think the murder end of it is going to be a lot longer. I did want to say also that at this point, what Richard was doing was he was breaking into homes where he didn't think anyone was home. So his point at this time was stealing things, general chaos. He was stalking people, but I don't think he was stalking them to attack them. He was stalking them and then like victimizing them through burglary. So it's kind of an interesting little like sideways step in his sort of escalation. And it definitely shows, that he's not afraid to do this in broad daylight. And later on, there is a lot of talk about how severely mentally ill he is, how that probably had a lot to do with his decision making. But I do want to call out that there's definitely, and we'll talk about this more in the second episode, but there's a lot of pre-planning here, whether you notice it or not. He definitely thought these things out. Like even just saying, if the doors are locked, I don't go in. If they're open, I do go in. Like that shows forethought. Like he's thinking about what he's doing. And there's a lot of back and forth because obviously he's mentally ill. But I think a lot of his trial, because he does get caught, obviously, centered around, was he aware of what he was doing? And I just want people to kind of think back through what I've already talked about and think about whether or not this seems pre-planned or if this seems just random. To me, it seems pre-planned, and there's going to be a lot more kind of evidence for that. And I think that's a really interesting part of this case because it shows that you can have somebody who is very mentally ill, but who is not out of control and who is not unable to know what they're doing. Anyway, guys, sorry this one's a little short and sorry for the 2-week break. Life comes at you fast, like I said. Always going to quote Ferris Bueller when I can. I will be back on a regular schedule. We'll have part 2 of this out next week. I would love to do back-to-back releases, but I'm still kind of getting back into the groove from needing this time away. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Please like, rate, review, share with your friends and family. Let's keep these little indie pods going. And until the next half of this horrible tale, stay safe.